Excited to be here because this is one of the few topics in my retirement that I can't seem to let go. And you'll notice from the title, I've been thinking about this for well over 20 years. Actually, it's like 25 now. So what I'd like to do today is to talk first about the broader notion of professionalization, give you the history of the essential competencies that were published in 2005 and the revision, the AEA version approved by the board in 2018. Oh my goodness, 5 years ago. Time flies. It is quite shocking to think about that. And then talk more broadly about what could be next steps. And most importantly for me is that you really think about, so what's in it for you? You know, does this affect you? Right now, at this moment in time, there's nothing, I was explaining to Brad, there's nothing that's pushing professionalization in our field. And that's a topic that I think is worth discussing. Okay, so I have the little subtitle, is it time for the field to take a stand or not? When we think about professionalization, the question is, has this train left the station? Are we actually in a place where we're thinking about that? So let me give you two sides to the discussion. On the positive side, and every PowerPoint I put together has some cats in it somewhere, so here they are. On the one hand, it does set the boundaries of professional practice. This is what evaluation is. This is what evaluators do, and this is what, you know, they don't do this other stuff. It can be very helpful to reflect on your practice if you have competencies in the professionalization field. It builds the field. We'll talk about that. And then those of us who teach evaluation, it's really helpful to have competencies because then you know what you really want students to learn. Okay, so that's the positive side, but not everybody thinks this is a good idea. There is a very negative view in Europe in particular about neoliberalism. And in North America, the hegemony, the idea that AEA and CES would be pushing this, you know, these ideas onto people. And so we have what I call the specter of professionalism. We're really out to limit people's opportunities. We don't want, you know, we want to limit who can become an evaluator. Oh, and we want prestige and status and, you know, we'll make more money. Are we oppressing people perhaps by doing this? Is it an unfair expense? Do we expect people to pay? And then, as I mentioned, the neoliberal conspiracy that is trying to control our field. And I am not kidding. People talk this way when they talk about it. Okay, so on the one hand, there's some positives associated with professionalism, and there's some perceived negatives. And there's probably some of each, actually, in reality. So I mentioned I've been doing this for a quarter century. Let's go back. AEA, the American Evaluation Association, has what we call 4 foundational documents. The first are not AEAs. The Program Evaluation Standards, which AEA is part of a group that put these together a long time ago, back in the 80s. But now there's the 3rd edition. Notice what year that was revised for the last time. It's quite a while ago. The AEA has a public statement on cultural competence. Notice its year. It's currently being revised. The guiding principles, AEA revised in 2018, which was also the same year that the board approved the competencies. So right now, the board has to figure out what kind of a process will be used. I'm sorry, we have Canadians here. What kind of a process will be used to revise these on a routine basis? Because obviously the world changes, things change, and we need to keep up. Okay, so that's the history. We have these 4 foundational documents. Way back in 1994, Blaine Worthen did a very interesting article that looked at our field and said, here are the criteria for judging whether it's a profession. And you'll notice, you know, at that time he was doing the analysis, his conclusions in 1994 were that we had several of the attributes that you can read there. But notice the bolded ones we didn't have in 1994, certification or licensure, a way to keep unqualified people out of the business, and then accreditation of preparation programs. So that was 1994. and I'm now speaking from the American context, little has changed. That is, we still don't have, in the US context, any form of certification or licensure. We still have no way to keep unqualified people out of the work, and there is no accreditation of preparation programs. Think about that. 29 years later, same thing. So the two that are that really have not been attended to are keeping unqualified people out and accrediting preparation programs. Actually, in Canada, you may have something and you can inform me about that, but in the US, there's nothing. So where action has occurred, there is no licensure, but there is, and I'll put it in scare quotes, certification of evaluators. So the Evaluators Institute at Claremont has a certificate, the University of Minnesota and others have certificates. And then CES has the designation, which really is an interesting process. It was created years ago. And I am told, and this is a very important point, CES stepped up to put it together when some government officials said, we're going to create a credential. We're going to put it together. And they said, oh, no, let us do it. We're the professional association, and so we will do it. And so there is this approved set of competencies, there's a rubrics, there's a process. And many people now are, Brad, do you know the number? It's a couple hundred, right, of credentialed evaluators.
Yeah, that sounds reasonable. It could be a little more or less. I haven't checked lately.
But there are some contracts where you have to have the credential in order to, or at least have somebody with the credential in order to bid on a contract. So that's a powerful thing. All right. So Canada has that system. And I will mention there are competency discussions all over the world. And it's, one thing that Lori, Stefan, and I do is to keep in touch with that and try to manage it. Japan, for instance, and Thailand both have a process for credentialing educational evaluators. It's very specific to school review. And the European Evaluation Society used to have VEPR, this voluntary evaluator peer review. It ended. It was based on volunteerism, and they couldn't sustain it. Okay. The point is, we don't have much going on in the way of credentialing in the world. We certainly don't have accreditation, and we have no way to keep unqualified people from doing the work that we value. But when we start thinking about competencies, in the bottom it says, are we in complete agreement then? Everybody's thinking about fruit. So when we say competencies, there's still confusion about what exactly what might mean. Now, we don't have a lot of time. What I would invite you to discuss at some point at some point is, so what? What if we do move forward with discussions of professionalization, or what if we don't do anything about it? Might it actually make any difference to any evaluator anywhere in the world? The way I phrase that question suggests my sad thought about this, that it probably wouldn't matter. Anyway, now let me go back. This is Wolling Hall at the University of Minnesota. And I want to tell you why I got involved with competencies at all. And to do that, I have to go back even farther. Brad and I were just saying, I worked in New Orleans, Louisiana for 10 years. And during that time, the State Department in Louisiana was very worried because there were people getting evaluation contracts who were charlatans. They didn't know how to do anything. So they said, what we're going to do is we'll put a credentialing system together. That'll control it. And so they hired Dan Stuffelbeam, Western Michigan University, came down, put together a program, which I participated in. And so I have bolded here, my type A Louisiana certificate is valid for life. And so I called a few years ago to see if it still existed, and nobody knew anything about any of it. It's long gone. But I got interested in, how do you use competencies to think about professional practice? And so I was teaching a graduate course with some very smart people. And we read articles that said, this was in the late 90s, you can't possibly have competencies, too much diversity in the field, blah, blah, negative. And after class, here are the three students. Jane Minima, who was in early childhood education. Gail is in special education and Lori was in teacher education. They all came up after class and said, we're in, complex fields and they're competencies. Why can't we have competencies? And so we made a pledge that we would work together. And literally sitting around my dining room table, that is my dining room table, there was never any funding for it. We just had a good time. And we created what we first called the Minnesota competencies. Somebody said, well, that's ridiculous. It applies to all evaluation. And so we created the essential competencies for program evaluators. What does it mean, competencies? Most competency literature talks about the KSAs. There's knowledge, there's skills, and there's attributes. So those are, when you say competencies, that's how they are usually broken out. Okay, so what did we do? We looked at the literature that was available at that time. We did a pilot study, and I'm embarrassed to tell you it was published. Please do not go look at that. It is, oh my goodness. Then afterwards, we spent 4 years and we call it a crosswalk, a comparison of all sorts of things. And in 2005, published the revised set that I feel pretty good about. And we had a couple of articles published. So here are the categories in the essential competencies. And you'll see it's a pie chart, which is probably not a good idea, but that's what we did. Starting with professional practice and systematic inquiry. Those are the most specific to what people typically think about with evaluation. Situational analysis is the fact that we walk into different places all the time. We have to manage our projects. You have to be able to work with people. And then ideally, we hope people will reflect on their practice. Okay, so this then, years go by, years pass. In 2014, I ran for the AEA board because now it's been 9 years. Nothing has happened with the competencies. And I thought, let's get something going. And so I got on the board, and then I became the chair of a task force. And so we absolutely relied on the CES's Credentialed Evaluator Program. And I want to thank Keiko and Brad, all the people who worked on that. It was all volunteer. And then there were two issues, a Canadian Journal issue and a New Directions. And as I said, I got on the board. And then this is the meaningful image of what our competencies task force was. It was the most incredible professional experience because everybody took a paddle and worked very hard to make things happen. It took us 3 years. And I will say it was before COVID. COVID would have messed up the process totally because you can't meet in person. And we were lucky enough every year to have at least a day-long meeting to be in each other's company and to work on things. And then once the board had approved them, we worked on an issue of New Directions to present and document what we had done. And then after that was published, and now we're in COVID, of course, the task force was sunsetted and a working group was created. That has meaning, the term task force versus working group, it doesn't matter. But AEA now has this working group that is trying to figure out, what should be next steps. Okay, just briefly, we're not going to talk much about the competencies, but you can see that, and this is thanks to the CES, there are now 5 domains of the competencies. And so one reflective practice got merged into professional practice. But these, Lori Steffen, who is an amazing scholar, and she's very detail-oriented, has done comparisons of 11 plus other sets of competencies. These are the domains that are common across all of them. And I put in the PowerPoint, here are resources. We're not going to talk specifically about competencies, but I do want to be clear about what they aren't. They are not a way to exclude qualified people. I mentioned we don't have that yet. But for many people, they think that somehow having competencies is going to do that. Nor are they a credentialing system. There's no assessment related to them. That is not their purpose. They are just a list of knowledge, skills, and attributes. That's what they are. And then the final point, they are not perfect. Of course, they're not perfect. They can't be. They're made by people. And so we know, even if they were perfect, which they can't be, but even if they were, context changes. And so they will always have to be adapted and changed. But they're not that. But what they are they have created common language, and criteria is something to talk about, right? And it is a way to at least start defining what's unique about the professional practice of evaluation. It is inclusive, because now we can say to people, here are the things you need to learn to do and know about in order to be an evaluator. And then finally, it is, we're on its progress on the path to professionalization. Okay, so what is next? And I say, what might this mean for you? So what? Well, as I mentioned, there is this working group. All 4 foundational documents now need to be revised. And I know that the cultural competence statement, there's a group working on that. And I believe the program evaluation standards, which is a separate group, I think they're working on it as well. But the board has to figure out how to get the competencies that are now 5 years old updated. So that's one thing. Secondly, the competencies were not finished. People say, well, wait a minute, shouldn't there be, different job functions? Evaluators play different roles. Shouldn't we have different competencies? You bet. And what about levels of expertise? There's a difference between a novice and a, experienced and then a master. And then the whole question of context and how does it work in different settings. And then you have different roles. I know in South Africa, they have competencies for commissioners of evaluation. We don't have that yet, the AEA version. Certain concepts need clarification. What do we mean by culture? Particularly now with the culture wars in our country, that is a huge issue. And the whole relationship with social justice, which was something our task force argued about, I shouldn't say argued, discussed at length repeatedly. That needs to be clarified. And then finally, research validation. Brad, of all people, is someone who knows the value of research. There has never been funding to study this stuff, which is incredibly frustrating. Anyway, so that's a long list of things that need to be done. And then the final point I want to make is the internationally voluntary organizations for professional evaluation. There are many, like 30, 35 organizations around the world. And it's time to take this on as an international project. Yeah. So the key issue, in my opinion, is number one, how can we get people to care about these at all? Because if you're working full time, I'm sorry, you may not have time to think about this, reflect on, all of that. So how do we get people to understand the value? And then more importantly, how do we get them to actually use the competencies? Lori Steffen recently made an interesting distinction between professionalization. That's thinking about the field and what can we do to make the field more. It is not a profession. A lot of people say it is. It is not, because we don't control some things that we need to control. So the distinction between professionalization and professionalism. Professionalism is what each one of us as an evaluator needs to think about and to reflect on. How do I become better at my practice? What am I doing in my practice? So that I think that's a helpful distinction. The other thing I realized recently, and it's related, this is a little bit off the subject, universities don't know where to stick evaluation training programs. They really don't. They often end up in measurement or in ed psych. Western Michigan used to be sort of at the college level, but I understand they've now been moved back into either psych or measurement. And I think part of the problem is the fact that, Michael Scriven says evaluation is a transdiscipline. Right. Because if you think about evaluation as a set of knowledge, skills, and attributes, those may be different for public health versus early childhood versus nuclear physics versus, think of all the fields that engage in evaluation. And that notion of transdiscipline is problematic because the other transdiscipline that's often mentioned is statistics. But statistics that, they're just working with data sets that have already been created. As evaluators, we have to go out and collect the data, make sense of it in context, be able to engage with people, et cetera. Anyway, as I say, it's a little bit off the subject and I'm not particularly articulate about it, but I think it's important that when we think about the competencies, because evaluation is so diverse, it really it's challenging. So I've talked enough. So what? What do these developments mean for you? And now what?